Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 1. Progeny of Hate. Chapter 18. The Mound Dwellers. Grin's Keep was little more than a garrison town, located on no trade route or highway of note. The structures surrounding the stone keep had a forbidding and harsh appearance, as if they were intended for the habitation of warriors only, and even this for but a season at a time. The keep itself was oddly round in construct, and out of harmony with the lines and angles of Aronite architecture seen elsewhere in the realm. It had clearly been rebuilt from a ruin, for a ragged line marked the addition of darker stone on top of the almost white foundations and lower levels. The name was derived from a local king who in ancient times had held it for several cycles against Aronite onslaught. It was a place easily defended, for it crowned the top of a hill and had several natural springs within its walls. Only the use of powerful siege weapons had eventually breached its walls and brought low the garrison. With the reduction of their stronghold, the will and resistance of the locals had faded into sullen subjection. Their civilization had declined over time, markedly during the times of hostility between Aran and Nuria, since their region had often been the arena for bloody battles, and had even been held by the Nurians for 23 bleak cycles. Aran had regained control in a bloodbath on the plains of Gull during the Suntide of 324 post-summoning, mainly because Nurian reinforcements had not been able to reach their beleaguered army in time. Ever since, Aran had kept a sizable force in Grin's Keep, mostly to counter any small Nurian incursions swiftly, but also to defend the plains till the main Aranite forces could arrive. The garrison commander was a man of great reputation, an old campaigner, renowned for his bravery, as well as his hatred for the magicians across the pass. Captain Raelf's courage was matched in Evrain's opinion only by his stupidity. During the many cycles they had fought together, their rivalry had been intense, and their differences had almost resulted in blows on more than one occasion. Yet they each had a grudging respect for the other, and though Raelf was nominally the superior, their dealings with each other were conducted on an even footing. Evrain seriously doubted the quality of the commander's judgment, but there was no escaping it in this matter. He could not simply smuggle his captive, whose story he entirely believed, past the authorities here to have him recognized as a Nurian somewhere else in Aran. Whatever he did with the boy would have to be with Raelf's approval. Gareth kept close to his two captors. He wore an overlarge, hooded cloak with the hood covering his telltale features, at once acting as a disguise and making it impossible to observe his surroundings as well as he would have liked. He was bursting with curiosity over this foreign town, one he previously had no reason to believe he would ever visit. He was walking among the mortal enemies of his kind, on their soil, and he was not allowed to see but glimpses of them. The scarlet Nurian surcoat had been bundled deep into one of their bags, and Gareth hoped that Evrain's old cloak could make him pass unnoticed among the Aranites, who were not so different in feature to the Nurians. Even when Evrain had instructed him to don the hood some miles from Grin's Keep, the man's tone had conveyed the severity of the situation, even to one who disobeyed almost out of habit. Now they approached the main gate to the town. Gareth could sense the threat he was walking into, and he became uneasy. What did they intend to do with him in this land, where his very appearance invited suspicion and hatred. Would they simply throw him in some dark hole to rot? He remembered the Aeronite soldiers who had relieved Evrain and Lur some 2 days before. The looks he had received, the silent enmity in their expressions, had quickly convinced him of the truth of Kenath's words regarding the type of men he would find in the pass. Had he met those instead, he would not have survived for long. Evrain had offered little explanation for his presence there, and he had sensed that the Aeronite captain was protecting him. Gareth wondered if that protection would avail him anything once inside the walls of Grim's Keep. He kept his gaze fixed on the booted heels of Lur in front of him, and stopped glancing left and right. There was little traffic at the gate, even though the sun was about to set, and it would undoubtedly be locked for the night. 2 men stepped out of the shadows of the arched structure to challenge them. Gareth caught a glimpse of heavy boots and mail leggings. The tone was friendly as they recognized the popular captain.
Captain Evrain, good it is to see you, sir.
The accent was heavily reminiscent of Linvale in the far west. Curiosity at the sight of the hooded figure made the man sound overeager.
Who is this with ye?
Evrain's voice was gruff and businesslike.
A captive we took in the pass, Vayford. A Nerian boy fallen foul of his own kind. A Viron, truly.
A rough hand gripped Gareth's shoulder, and another pulled back the hood. He stared up into the excited face of the Aeronite guard, a man in his middle cycles with broad, weather-beaten features. Fair hair spilled from under his steel helm, framing a furrowed brow and slightly bulging gray eyes. A scraggly beard of slightly darker hue lined his jaw.
Lin's truth, he's but a stripling.
The teeth were good, free from the stain of friend. There was also none of the nauseating stale smell. The other guard took a step closer. He was darker than his compatriot, and the corners of his mouth were grooved deeply, as if they were permanently turned down in disapproval. He had but caught a glimpse of the boy before he turned his head to spit on the ground in disgust.
Where'd you get it?
Some ways up the pass. Not that it concerns ye.
This came from Lur, who disliked the way these warriors spoke to the captain.
Step aside, so that we can get to our well-deserved rest.
Vayford looked at him askance, and then turned back to Evrain.
I'll call Captain Rafe, sir. You'll want somewhat to say, I warrant.
Lur stared at him in disbelief.
You're going to let us stand here and wait. Is that it?
The guard looked pleadingly at Evrain.
Begging your pardon, sir. But you know the captain. I want no trouble with him.
Evrain raised a hand.
Of course not.
His manner was placating, but inwardly he chafed at the delay, and even more so at the authority of the man who had caused it. He turned away unconcernedly, while Vayford trudged off and allowed his gaze to linger on the snowy peaks in the east. Even during the sun-tide day, the cold could be felt at the slightest stirring of the breeze, and where they stood in the shadow of the wall, the heat of their day-long march had already ebbed away. He pulled his fur-lined coat closer around his shoulders. 2 days had passed since he had started the sharp descent into the plains of Gull that marked the first stage of his homeward journey, and yet the cold still reached after him with its lingering farewell. It would be a pleasure to get home to Kiel and the endless sunny days of the south. He glanced at his captive. The boy seemed indifferent enough, though he had something of the trapped animal about him, especially when Vayford had pulled back his hood just before. He would surely be nervous if he knew just how close he was to a painful death. Raelf was a big man, with a powerful build, even past his prime. His voice and manner matched his frame, to the point of making him impossible to ignore. Evrain wondered if this had not been the primary cause of his preferment by the former king above so many more able men. However, he inspired men with his loud confidence, even to such a degree that it could turn the tide of a battle. Now he made a characteristic entrance. He clapped Evrain on the back as if they were the best of friends.
Completed your 6 seasons, Captain.
His joviality was unconvincing, but perchance intentionally so.
Time to head south again, eh? Well, give my regards to the old rock, will you?
He guffawed loudly. Evrain had noticed that his eyes had made a fine scrutiny of the Nurian boy without looking directly at him. All the while the captive frowned back at him, obviously distrustful of the display.
So, where is this prisoner of yours?
Raelf smiled half-mockingly.
We took this boy some 4 miles from the lookout command.
Evrain gestured needlessly in Gareth's direction.
He is your prisoner.
Raelf purposely did not look at the boy.
This Viron whelp?
Something odd was happening to the captain, as if the very sight of a Nurian would push him beyond sanity. Veins knotted at his temples. His face was flushed with the beginnings of a murderous rage. Evrain pursed his lips and stared at the commander without replying.
Why then is he wandering about unbound, like a guest?
The captain's hands were on his hips. His eyes bulged slightly, and his mouth had settled into an ugly grimace.
He was very weak when we found him. Besides, he had no chance of slipping away from us.
He already slipped past your lookouts, did he not?
Evrain smiled inwardly at how the lookouts had now become his.
If you will allow me...
Raelf had had enough. He leaned closer and spoke half under his breath, yet sufficiently loudly for all to hear.
You bring that thing in here, you chain him up.
Gareth could see little flecks of spittle appear in the man's beard as he spewed out the words. He turned on his heel without waiting for a reply. Evrain sat back with relief. He had not been interrupted during the last and most fantastic part of the tale. Raelf's interjections had already added about an hour to the telling, but his disbelieving and contemptuous snorts had faded towards the end. Now he merely stared at his subordinate, his mouth set in a hard line.
I don't believe a word of it.
His voice was flat. Evrain was prepared, but he did not want to seem overeager. He folded his arms.
Neither do I, of course, but I led him to think that I do.
He was careful to look straight into Raelf's eyes as he spoke.
No doubt he is a spy, or the contact of a spy. They made sure that I would be the one to find him. His contact would be in Kiel, where they expect me to take him. Once there, he will pass on the information he has accumulated by passing through here and all the way down the coast. His contact will ship him back to Nuria.
He smiled ruefully.
A neat little plan, not so?
Raelf sat wide-eyed.
And why by Imran's light did you go along with it?
Evrain sprung his trap. He leaned forward and lowered his voice.
We will use this knowledge to our advantage. I will pretend that we suspect nothing. All the while, I will keep a close watch on our young friend. When he attempts to make contact,
He snapped his fingers.
we will nab both him and the other.
He smiled broadly.
If we slit his throat now, we will never dig out the mole in Kiel.
The older man stared at him, his forehead creased with the effort of thinking.
Suppose he or the contact gets away from you.
I considered that possibility, so I've already started misinforming him, in a casual way, about the numbers and disposition of our forces. He will believe them to be at least 3 times stronger than what they are in reality. I force him to wear the hood while passing through town, and I tell him it is for his own protection. If he does slip away, his information will be less than worthless. It will count in our favor if it ever reaches Nuria.
Raelf slowly shook his head. His face softened into a grin. Then he laughed uproariously.
I have said it before, Evrain. You have your uses. This little Viron plan will not catch us napping. Oh no. They will find we have brains to match theirs, and more.
The 2 men rose simultaneously, and smiling, grasped each other by the hand.
Take this little twister down south with you, Captain Evrain, and keep a close eye on him.
boy was unusually quiet, even sullen. They were 2 days out of Keep, and had made good progress. A steady day's march should bring them to the outskirts of the city of Rasfarin, which lay on the southern fringe of the plains of Gull. They had struck inland after leaving the keep, for the road here afforded easier going than the coastal one, which twisted and turned down to the level of the sea at Lee, before ascending again to the plateau. Theirs was the longer route, which meant that they could part company with the rest of the Aeronite warriors on their way home, something that Evrain believed to be better for his captive. Now the boy sat wistfully poking in the embers with a stick. Evrain thought of the pale face and accusing eyes that had greeted him at the cells after he finally had been granted permission to release the lad. Though there was no reason for it, he felt that he had betrayed the trust and somehow damaged the easy rapport that had existed between them from the start. As if reading his mind, the boy looked up at him, his odd animal eyes catching the firelight.
It's not that we don't believe you, Neil.
Evrain felt that he had to make an effort. Perhaps Lur had been right. He wanted to believe this boy, wanted to... what? Find some substitute for his son swallowed by the ocean? He shrugged inwardly.
Raelf, Captain Raelf, discounted your story as a lie simply because you are Nurian. That is his nature. I had to play along to get him to release you. I never thought you to be a spy. It's simply too ridiculous.
Lur stirred uncomfortably at this. He glanced behind him in the dark, as if he was half afraid that someone would overhear. The boy smiled wryly.
They hate me, just like the priests, and and the king.
Gareth had caught himself in the nick of time. He made an effort to throw off the moodiness. It had made him careless, and he could not afford a slip.
What are you talking about?
Evrain looked at him curiously.
What priests?
Gareth thought furiously.
They would have me dead, just for knowing the truth about their plotting.
The man was not convinced. Something tugged at his memory. Some thread of the tale the boy had spun for them was unraveling quickly.
How is it that you know the questers that conspired to kill the prince?
I told you. I recognized the men who did it. They work for the priests.
And what reason would the king have to hate you?
I...
The same reason as the priests? That you knew about the assassins?
Evrain leaned forwards as he spoke.
Or why would the king of Nuria even notice a young cadet in the guard?
Yes, the same.
Gareth saw the trap too late.
Then you hold that the king conspired with the priests to kill his own son. And how is it that you would know of this?
I know. I heard because...
He bit his lip. Evrain lowered his voice.
There is something you are not telling me.
Gareth was on his feet.
Stop asking me.
The man's voice was kind. He had sensed something of the inner struggle of his captive.
Tell me the truth.
Gareth was ready to explode. The world was a twisted tangle of truth and lies, and his mind was spinning with it all. There were too many voices now, too many impressions, and he had lost his will to resist. In they flooded, released from his control, the pale, distant smile of his mother, the veiled threat in Talon's eyes, the false play of his brother, the droning of the priests in the temple, the relief in his father's manner at the news of his death, the strong grip of a border guard on his cheeks, the cold dark of the cell in Keep, but above them all, the sickness of a mutilated body in the death tree. He heard himself shouting.
I know he was a part of it, because I saw he was happy when he learned of it, because he stood by when they killed my mother, because they killed Ryan in my place, because I am this prince who should be dead.
Evrain and Lur exchanged surprised glances. They rose to their feet. This was beyond what either had suspected. The boy was flushed and stared at them wildly.
Now that you know, you can put me back in the cell. You can try to trade me for some advantage to the king, but I am not a prince of Nuria anymore. I will deny it. My name is Gareth of Belruth, and I have no father.
He turned his back on them. The men could see that he was trembling. Lur was the first to speak.
Ye are the prince himself, then. All right, but there's nobody that knows it save us.
He cleared his throat.
We don't trade people for advantage.
It took a moment or two longer for Evrain to recover. Lur's comment had at least assured him of an ally in the most unpatriotic feelings that he had experienced at the boy's outburst. He knew at once that he would do what he could to aid him, though his first duty should have been to serve the interest of his king. His voice was light and without emotion.
That is the truth, then.
There was no accusation.
Well, come and sit down, Gareth without a father, so we can decide what to do.
The placating voices and lack of anger at his deception did much to dispel the overpowering despair to which Gareth had succumbed. He stood still, clenching his teeth, waiting for his breathing to become regular. The last thing he wanted to do was to burst into helpless tears now that his frustration was spent. When he could trust himself, he turned around and, feeling a little silly, joined the waiting men. He avoided their eyes as he sat down. They talked till Lauren's eyes were directly overhead. Though Gareth repeatedly insisted that Evrain take no risks on his account, the Aeronite assured him of his protection, and in the end of the boy's anonymity. If the Nurian prince had died at the hand of assassins, there was no need to resurrect him. He had not come to them with some malicious scheme, but to seek asylum. That part of his story had been true from the start. They had been prepared to give it to him before, and as far as they were concerned, this had not changed. The morning, at least, was bright and cheerful. They had lost their chance of an early start, and faced the probability of another night camping in the open. Though he was eager to reach his home, Evrain was in no frantic hurry, and he considered that it was perhaps for the best that they did not spend the night in Rosfarren, where they would avoid drawing unwanted attention only by a miracle. They traveled along in subdued silence, still too conscious of the emotional statements of the night before. The landscape had changed rather abruptly since the previous afternoon, the grassy plains giving way to low mound-like hills to the north and west. These gradually encroached on the road itself, forcing it to abandon the easy meandering on the level of the plain for an undulating twist and turn among woody slopes. Even the soil seemed to change color and texture to a reddish clay, especially to the west, where rainwater had eroded some slopes to the point of no longer being able to support vegetation. Evrain was relieved when these changes pricked the boy's curiosity, and they finally had something to talk about. He explained a little about the nature of this land and its people, though he had no great respect or liking for either. Formerly cattle raisers and farmers on the plains of Gull, they had stubbornly retreated into the northern hills where some of the more backward clans subsisted on hunting and small-scale farming. Their pride demanded some form of independence from the Aeronite conquerors, though many of them served in the garrison at Grin's Keep, and some had even migrated southwards into the cities of the coast. For the most part, though, they kept aloof, making their homes in the clay hillsides, tending their meager flocks, nursing the insults and grudges of the past. 3 miles of walking brought them to a crossroad. The clay mound surrounded them by now, sprouting clumps of small, gnarled trees at the base, and occasionally crowned with the same, like plumes on a crested helm. The leaves of these shrub-like copses were so dark that they seemed almost black when in shade. Only the direct sunlight revealed a dull greenish hue. Evrain pointed out that the yawl, as the locals called them, grew only in the red soil of the area. Once the stone root marker came into view, he abruptly broke off his explanations. Seated in the shade of the great stone were 6 men. They slowly raised to their feet as the threesome approached. Gareth noticed that they were clad in dusty animal skins, appeared somewhat unkempt, and were well armed. One, who seemed to be the leader, raised a hand in casual greeting. He was smiling.
Captain Evrain, good it is to meet you. Though you are a little later than we had expected.
He spoke Aeronite with a heavy accent. Gareth immediately had the impression that it was deliberate. Evrain did not like the look of the fellow in front of him. The man was dirty, Not because of lack, deprivation, or extensive travel. He was that way out of habit. Everything about him, from his jacket and goatskin leggings to his disheveled hair peeking from under a leather cap, was unkempt. Only his long beard, greased and plaited with leather thongs, was neatly forked. He looked in every way like the brigand he probably was. The opening statement had been meant to intimidate, or at least to challenge. Evrain wrinkled his nose as he replied.
Do I know you, friend?
Not likely, since we have not met before.
The man's smile widened somewhat. Apparently he was enjoying himself.
My name is Gare. My allegiance is to Lord Yennig of the Free Clans.
He had lifted his chin as he spoke, and placed a hand on the protruding head of a hand axe shoved through his belt.
Lord Yennig?
Though he had heard the name before, Evrain was not aware of any special status of this mound dweller, other than his claim to the leadership of a single clan. One of the other men replied somewhat condescendingly.
Lord Yennig of the Black Fern. He commands the allegiance of all the clans now.
Hold your tongue, Fresh. I'll do the talking here.
Gare frowned at the particularly filthy individual to his right. Lur, standing a little behind Evrain, exchanged glances with Gareth and spoke under his breath.
Doesn't seem too fresh to me.
He touched his nose and grimaced. The boy stared at him for a moment before smiling in return. Evrain took a step closer to the men.
How is it that you know me, and that I would be passing this way?
A slight annoyance had crept into his tone. Gare looked away before answering. He lifted his chin a little more and spoke to the wind.
Yennig keeps his ear to the ground, don't he?
Evrain noticed that the chieftain's title had abruptly disappeared.
So it seems.
He waited till the man was facing him again.
Well, state your business.
Gare now seemed reluctant to meet his eye.
My lord requests your presence in the town of Plymouth.
He lifted a hand when he saw Evrain's raised eyebrows.
Only a few miles out of your way, to be sure. He needs your valued opinion on an urgent matter, one touching the security of the realm.
He failed to keep the sneer out of his voice. An uneasiness rooted itself in Evrain. He noticed that the moundsman was not so much avoiding his eyes as catching glimpses of Gareth. Though it could be simple curiosity, the fact that he tried to conceal it suggested some insidious motive. The thought of accompanying this man and his band of scarecrows seemed at once preposterous.
Since when has your kind taken an interest in the security of the realm?
Gare laughed loudly while glancing knowingly this way and that at his men, who stared at him uncomprehendingly.
Lord Yennig foresaw that you may take this attitude. Yet the matter is of such importance that he could not leave it to my explanations or your understanding.
He touched the axe in his belt again. This time his hand remained on it.
You will have to come along without knowing all the concerns, I'm afraid.
The sudden threat of violence stunned the Aeronite captain. Who did these barbaric hovel-dwellers think they were, to threaten an Aeronite commander? His mind worked furiously to make sense of this odd behavior. He had been out of the reach of news for 6 seasons, yet he could not imagine what could have taken place during that time to transform these pest-ridden mead flies into the strutting cockerels confronting him now. Was there a general insurrection in Arran, with the High King overthrown? That these miscreants did not fear his displeasure? Surely Captain Railf would have shared tidings of such import with him. Yet there was too much confidence on the other side to force a confrontation. His ignorance of the other's motives hampered him, and made decisive action risky.
And if I choose not to accompany you?
The mound dwellers stirred at these words, but their leader spoke quickly in reply.
There is really no choice. We must insist that you do.
Evrain disliked the man intensely. The patronizing tone offended him.
Are you threatening me?
Gare raised his hands in mock consternation.
No! Why would I do such?
He smiled toothily.
We are but poor tenants in the lands of our lords of Arran.
Yet you leave me no choice.
My lord was most specific in his instructions.
For a moment or two, Evrain calculated the odds of besting the band of scoundrels. It was unlikely that the 3 of them would escape unscathed, for it was difficult to estimate the skill of these barbarians. Besides, he could not be sure that they were alone. For all he knew, there could be a dozen archers lurking nearby. They had caught him completely unexpectedly. He could not have foreseen such hostility from these pathetic creatures, or he would have remained with the body of soldiers traveling the coastal route. He would have to play along till he knew their true intentions and strength. He capitulated.
Very well, if it is of such importance to you.
The man bowed deeply before sweeping his arm to point dramatically down the road he wanted them to take. The few miles stretched into more than 10 before they caught sight of their destination. Evrain had been forced to keep up the pretense of cooperation once a dozen or more hidden archers had joined the group. They carried wicked-looking short bows and kept them at the ready throughout as they brought up the rear. The Aaronites and their companion were little more than prisoners, though they could have done nothing to prevent it. Any resistance would have been futile and would probably have proved fatal. It was well into the afternoon watch, and the shadows were already deep among the tall red hillsides. Almost unexpectedly, these fell away to reveal a series of low, flat mounds, like the remains of a heavily eroded plateau, oddly similar in shape. One could almost believe that human hands had shaped them thus for habitation. Indeed, even as they approached, they could make out the gaping holes of sculpted windows and doorways, the lazily curling smoke of cooking fires, and soon the scurrying shapes of the people who had made these strange hills their homes. There was a quickening of steps among the band of mound dwellers around them, and a relaxing smile or two. It was evident that these men were relieved that their errand had been completed without incident. Their leaders seemed friendlier now, even jovial, though he kept stealing furtive glances at the Viron boy. Soon the rattle of goats' bells and the wailing of a human baby echoed in their ears. Evrain felt a little of his apprehension slip away. It could well be that Yennig had merely chosen his messenger badly, or that he, as an Aaronite from the far south, understood too little of the customs and mannerisms of these still savage people. The mundane sights and sounds of the village did much to allay his fears. There was little sinister about the ragged urchins, the old men sunning themselves in silence, or the stoop-shouldered woman who stared at them accusingly as they came into view. These people were poor. No doubt they often went hungry, and like all such, they needed someone to blame for their misery. Half a dozen mongrels rushed out at them, snarling. They were in poor condition, with ribs showing, and their barking was half-hearted, as if they expected to be kicked aside. Gare ignored these, and marched into what probably served as the town square, with the air of a returning hero. Though some 24 children and youths flocked round them, expecting something exciting to happen, he did not hesitate or slow his pace. With the jabbering band tailing after them, they made their way to one of the doorways into the earth. Gareth pressed closer to his companions. The disquietude that had settled upon him ever since the first encounter with the Moundsmen deepened now they entered the odd village, and he was convinced that they had not been brought here for their benefit. There was a palpable threat in the air, as though all these people were eager for their hurt. The doorway was larger than any of the others he had seen, and it was supported by large blocks of stone. Grotesque faces had been carved into these, demons of antiquity, some contorted with pain or rage, all hideous and exuding the malice they had been intended to embody. Here their captor halted, hesitating, uncertain for the first time. The swirl of people behind him pressed together for a moment, before they too abruptly ceased their movement. A moment later, a figure stepped through the doorway. There was something like a despairing sigh from the crowd at the sight of him. An inaudible moan escaped them unawares as they recoiled. Several hands moved secretly behind backs, to make a sign for averting enchantment or evil. The man was tall, wrapped in a long cloak of shimmering greenish black. There was the glint of gold at his neck and on his fingers. He was entirely bald, and his face was hairless, lacking even eyebrows and lashes. It had a mask-like quality, reminiscent of the more human-looking faces carved on the stones. Gareth saw the men of the tribe hastily drop to one knee. He alone remained standing, with Evrain and Lur, their lack of action appearing suddenly defiant. The stone-faced figure looked at them directly, from one to the other, taking their measure. He felt the eyes fasten upon him, almost like a physical touch, loathsome and lingering. This man meant him the gravest of ill. The bald man beckoned to Gare without taking his eyes off the strangers. His voice was a rasping breath. He spoke without accent.
You have done well. Lord Yennik will be pleased.
He looked at the kneeling man and beckoned again, impatiently. Gare rose to his feet. There was no trace of his swagger now. The man looked at him before continuing.
Your lord is indisposed at present. See to the comfort of our guests. No doubt they are tired.
He took a step closer and said something not loud enough for any but Gare to hear. There was a faint smile and a nod in the direction of Evrain before he turned abruptly and disappeared through the doorway. The boys and men of the tribe rose to their feet, as if the departure of the odd man had reanimated them. There were whisperings and murmurs as they came back to life. Gare took charge once more. He motioned to the Aaronites to follow, and strode off deeper into the maze of red mounds. Gareth could see that Evrain was angered at the delay, and possibly the manner of the bold man, but he had trudged off resignedly after Gare all the same. Lur waited for him to follow the captain before falling in behind. He alone seemed unperturbed. The village appeared to stretch endlessly into the clay hills. They passed scores of doorways, most lined with stone blocks, but none quite as imposing as the one in front of which Gare had first halted. Evrain spoke to the pacing moundsman on his flank.
Who was that man speaking to Gare?
He kept his voice low. The man looked at him askance. His reply was in the same low tone.
His name is Rost.
He glanced behind him nervously.
He came back with Lord Yennik from the east. He is the clan's strange man now.
Gare veered left abruptly, slowed his pace, and stopped once more. The doorway was identical to most of the others in Gareth's eyes. Blocks of stone lined the sides and supported a heavy lintel. All were carved with unrecognizable objects and patterns, somewhat worn by the elements. The moundsman leaned in and shouted a name, or a greeting in his own language. There was an answering shout, and the light of a lantern or torch appeared inside. The sun had set by now, and the shadows among the mounds were deep. The glow of the approaching light cast a latticed pattern through the gaping doorway and over the men waiting outside. Gare stooped and stepped through. He beckoned to them to follow suit. Inside, the floor sloped down slightly into a large room, bare of any furnishing or decoration. Several doorways, similarly lined with stone supports and curtained with animal skins, confronted them in the semi-dark. A dank, moldy odor permeated the air. The torch-bearing man stepped through an archway which lacked a door of skin, spilling the light into the entrance hall. He matched Gare in attire and filthiness, but had at least twice his cycles. He nodded at his fellows and the strangers without pausing in his stride, and proceeded to light several wall lamps around the room, all the while conversing with Gare in their language. At last there was a little stir of laughter at one of his remarks, and he looked directly at the three outsiders for the first time. Gare addressed himself to Evrain.
He says you are most welcome to lodge here till morning. Unfortunately, he does not speak your excellent language at all.
He made a face.
Old people, very traditional.
The man stood smiling at them, as if he knew that Gare was saying such flattering things about him. The younger man continued.
I will be back for you in the morning. Just follow this old hag to your quarters. If there is some dire need, just mention my name and he will know to fetch me.
He turned away and spoke to the man again, who promptly motioned them forward through the open archway. Gareth felt the unfamiliar sounds of the language flow around him, like music staggered and out of time, It was strangely irritating to listen and not understand, as if the elusive meaning lured him on a futile quest. Again he thought of the mirror pool and the rippling image in the water. If only he could stay long enough for it to settle. The Aeronite men were moving towards the door. Their new host still stood smiling, a ring of old keys hanging on his hide belt, the torch gripped in one hand. He nodded continuously, as if he was very pleased with the turn of events. He was a picture of goodwill and cooperation. Something in the man's manner did not make sense. A cold dread suddenly took hold of Gareth. The mud wall seemed to close in on him, and he knew instinctively that he should not step through that door. He held back, yet Evrain already had him by the arm, irritated by his reluctance. He looked down at the child, saw for a moment the urgent appeal in his eyes, and stopped short.
What is it?
Gareth did not speak. He merely mouthed the word trap. His eyes were large and urgent. Evrain's own suspicions crystallized. The fatigue and frustration had temporarily dulled his mind, but now he realized that there would be no return once they had stepped through the door. He turned to Gare, thinking frantically. Confronting the Mound's men in the confined space was suicidal. There were at least a score between him and the door, and who knew how many outside? Some were armed with bows, most with axes. The press of bodies would overcome him and Lur ere long. He spoke forcefully.
I prefer making my own camp in the open. We shall not need your friend's hospitality tonight.
Gare, who had noticed something of the exchange between the man and boy, reached for his axe. He gripped it, but did not pull it free as yet.
It is not safe to camp in the open out here. Once again, I must insist that you make use of the offer.
There was no sneer in his voice now. He knew the moment of confrontation had come. Lur stepped back from the doorway, his hand on the hilt of his sword. He realized the situation was hopeless, but then it had been no better since they had run into the Mound dwellers that morning. Seeing as there was no escape, he would make sure some of the wretches accompanied him to the afterlife. He grabbed hold of Gareth's cloak and pulled the boy back till he was behind them. He was unarmed and not strong enough besides to do much good in a fight. All the men in the hallway had tensed at Gare's words. Some had already unsheathed their axes. A few reached for arrows. Evrain held up his hands in a placating gesture.
It will profit you little to murder a captain and soldier of Aaron.
There was a scuffle behind him as the forgotten torchbearer grabbed hold of Gareth. As if this was the signal for action, mayhem broke loose in the cramped space. Evrain whipped out his sword just in time to parry 2 blows from the closest men. Lur had to strike his first blow with a gloved fist before he could draw his blade. The Moundsmen rushed him with a shout, obscuring the marks for their archers, who held back in frustration. Gareth struggled against the iron grip of the man's arm round his body. His arms were free, but he could not reach behind him. The torch, held in his assailant's left hand, swung this way and that as he struggled and twisted to free himself. He tried to pry the fingers from his clothing, but the hand was tough as the bark of a tree and would not budge. If he could not escape this grip, the 2 men would soon be overwhelmed. Already they had locked shoulders in the doorway. Hanging limply in the clasp, his throat tight with desperation, it occurred to him what to do. He brought down his booted heel as hard as he could on the man's toes. There was a shout of pain, and for a moment the arm round his chest relaxed its grip. With strength born of mortal fear, he wrenched the torch from the man's hand. There was a muffled swear word from the Moundsman, but he gave him no time to recover. A scream of anguish followed as he thrust the flames into the man's face. Even the struggling men in the entrance were given pause. They were unnerved already by the stout defense of the men from Aaron. 2 of their number were severely wounded. A third lay lifeless underfoot. For a moment they wavered. Gare took charge. With an oath, he ordered his men back to give the archers a clear shot. Evrain glanced behind him. The old man was kneeling, his hands clutched to his face. The boy stood wavering, a little startled by his success. Behind him a passage stretched away into the dark.
Back!
He shouted, as the first poorly aimed missiles whistled through the air. He grabbed for Lur's sleeve and turned to run. In the hall, the moundsmen hesitated, not sure if they should leave a line of sight for the archers or pursue. Evrain heard Ger's bellow of frustration, only faintly, as he streaked down the passage, one hand holding his sword, the other dragging the boy behind him. Lur was on their heels, his breath already racing. Their first few paces had carried them past a large, heavy grille made of iron and hinged like a door. Round a turn, they nearly plunged headlong down a flight of earthen steps. Evrain slowed his pace and grabbed the torch from Gareth. He held it to the side as he sprinted downwards, so that the shadow cast by his body would not obscure the way for his companions and cause them to stumble. The stairs were steep and dangerous, broken and uneven in places. By some miracle they reached the bottom without a mishap. Here there was some light, illuminating a large room furnished with tables and benches. A fire burned low in a grated hearth. On the walls were racks for weapons, mostly empty but for a few wooden spears and a half-dozen short bows. Two dark doorways stared at them from the far wall. Evrain halted for a moment, listening for sounds of pursuit. There was some shouting and excitement above them, but it still seemed distant. He sheathed his sword.
Take these.
He tossed two of the bows to Lur and Gareth, taking a third himself. He turned to the boy.
Can you handle one of these?
Gareth strung it quickly and expertly.
I'm sure one this size.
His voice seemed small to himself.
They're stronger than they look. Hold this.
Evrain handed Gareth back the torch to string his bow. Then he grabbed a bundle of arrows and ripped away the thong with his teeth. He half considered dropping his pack here to improve his mobility and asking Lur to do the same. Then he decided against it. It would matter little in the end.
Let's move.
He headed for the passages at the far end of the room, all the while wondering at the moundsmen's tardiness. Why would they be so reluctant to follow their quarry down here? He took the torch again. 10 paces down was another iron grille door standing open. Before long they saw several more, framed in stone doorways to left and right. These were not entrances to passages, but to small rooms. Evrain's heart sank.
It's a prison of some kind.
He shouted back to Lur. They halted in consternation. Before them was another stairway into the dark. Lur spoke first.
What do we do?
He was still breathing heavily. Evrain stared at him.
We'll have to fight our way out.
He smiled wanly.
We're properly trapped. There will be no other exit but the one above.
He tilted his head to listen. It was ominously quiet. He put his finger to his lips and handed the torch back to Gareth. Fitting an arrow to the bow, he motioned to the others to follow. Lur swallowed hard and kept his mouth wide open to dull the sound of his breathing. Gareth kept his bow ready in his left hand. He would have to drop the torch before he could fit an arrow. In the furnished room, nothing stirred but the movement of shadows caused by the firelight. Evrain pulled back the bowstring. All was oddly quiet. He crept forward, keeping to the wall, stopping occasionally to listen. Lur moved over to the other doorway and peered in. He could make out more cells in the dim light. The stairs were deserted. Evrain climbed noiselessly, his arm aching with the strain of keeping the bowstring pulled back. The other two hung back, ready to cover a probable hasty retreat. He rounded the curve of the walls at the top of the stairs, the dank smell of the clay earth in his nostrils. There was the heavy grille, shut now, and certainly locked. Still no one in sight. Of course, they need not guard what was already securely locked up. He felt a complete fool for trying to escape into a prison. If he survived to tell this tale, he would never hear the end of it. Now he could make out muffled conversation. It was in the barbarian tongue. There was a moaning, too, the wounded, no doubt, and the old man with his burnt face. He froze. There was some movement now, a louder, clearer voice. 2 men carrying bows marched through the doorway. Evrain hesitated. It almost cost him his life. Shouting, the men leaped forward to the bars. 2 or 3 others hustled up behind them. He turned to bolt back down the stairs. He could already hear the whistling of arrows. One struck him in the back, but strangely there was no pain. As he reached safe ground, there was another sound. Laughter. His two companions stared at him with round eyes, their bows held ready. The boy was trembling slightly. He flung his own on a table and slumped down on one of the benches. Lur stirred first.
What is it?
Evrain smiled ruefully.
You can stand down, friend Lur. They are content with locking us in, for now at least.
The other stared at him, but did not move. He patted the bench next to him.
Come, have a seat. They have locked the iron gate and are standing guard for us. No doubt this is what they intended all along. Come, give me a hand with this arrow.
He pointed a casual thumb at his back. This last brought Lur to life.
You're wounded.
He placed his bow next to Evrain's and searched for the arrow. Then he smiled.
Just remove your back.
The arrow had penetrated the leather of his pack, but there it had been halted by some object. He shuddered to think that he had almost removed it earlier. Lur felt around inside, then broke off the shaft and pulled out the arrowhead, lodged firmly in a little wooden box.
It seems your good fortune has not entirely deserted ye.
Evrain stared at the box. He well knew what was inside. It was a polished shell, brown on white, flecked with amber and gold, the sound of the ocean inside it. He carried it on journeys with him. It had been Zane's naming gift. He pried out the metal arrowhead with his dagger and opened the box. There it was still, fragile but unharmed. There was little to do but wait out the night. They were hungry and tired, and above all thirsty. There was little water left among their supplies, and a search of the place yielded but one skin of sour wine and an almost empty water barrel. A small amount of dried meat and a few wedges of goat's cheese had been left on the table, and these they consumed to save their own dwindling supplies. There was still the hope of an escape, and a subsequent mad rush cross-country for Rasfarin. They had no way of telling the time, but it had to have been into the third watch of the night when Lur shook the other two awake. The fire had receded to a dull glow for lack of fuel, and they had doused the torch to save it. Evrain was aware of the hand covering his mouth, and the urgent expression on the face shoved so close to his. Lur motioned with his eyes towards the doorways in the far wall. As he did so, there was a loud thump in the darkness. Both men reached for their bows. Gareth felt around for his, but could not find it. Sounds of scuffling and another loud thud followed. The men, cowering behind a table, looked at each other in surprise. Whoever was trying to sneak up on them was making a real mess of it. Now a small, stifled moan floated out of the dark. Gareth had joined the men. He covered one door with Lur, Evrain the other. A tense moment or two followed, and then a low voice spoke clearly out of the dark.
Don't shoot, Captain. I'm not here to harm you. I am alone. This is no trap.
There was a slight accent, but the voice sounded civil enough.
Step through the doorway, and keep your hands away from your sides.
Evrain spoke in the same low voice. He grabbed Lur by the shoulder and pointed him in the direction of the stairs. While their attention was focused elsewhere, it would be easy to surprise them from above. A cloaked figure appeared, hands held aloft. It halted just inside the door.
I am here to aid you. If you do not escape, you will not live to see another night.
Come closer.
Evrain stood up from behind the table.
Who are you? And why would you want to aid me?
The man stepped into the glow of the fire. He motioned towards a bench and sat down when Evrain nodded. He was obviously a mound dweller, not only by his dress, but also by his manner.
My name is Uthard. I have received an urgent instruction to ensure your escape from here tonight. Where is your prisoner?
He glanced around.
You still have him?
Yes, I do.
Evrain motioned in Gareth's direction.
What of it?
It is vital that he escapes with you. That was my instruction.
There was relief in the voice.
I am sorry that I only arrived now. I had a terrible time finding my way through the tunnels.
Evrain was still suspicious. Lur kept covering the stairs.
Who is it that wants to ensure my escape?
The man smiled, showing good teeth.
There are more forces at work in my role than you are aware of, Captain Evrain. Even here among the mounds of the north, powerful lords have their agents.
He clasped his hands together nervously.
But we have little time. You will have to trust me out of desperation only.
Fine.
Evrain knew he had no choice, but this very fact irked him.
And just how are we going to crawl out of here? In fact, how did you get in here?
It sounded like an accusation.
Listen, if I had intended to trick you, the warriors would be swarming in by now. Truth is, there are hundreds of miles of tunnels and caverns under and inside these hills. If you know your way about, there is hardly any place secure.
He gestured towards the cells.
Sometimes they are discovered and sealed, but even from here one can escape undetected. I came in through a cell wall. It was my good fortune that the cell door was not locked.
Evrain had made up his mind.
Well, you thought, if you have come to show us a way of escape, we are ready to attempt it. There is nothing to gain in staying here.
Glad I am to hear it.
The man rose to his feet.
Gather your things. We can talk on the way.
In the cell, they could see what had caused the thudding noises earlier. 2 halves of a stone block the size of a wagon wheel had been dislodged from their place some 10 feet up, and had thudded into the thick dust of the earthen floor. Uthard had taken the torch from Gareth and motioned towards the hole with it.
Up there. It's quite a drop, I'm afraid.
He held a hand to his rope. One by one they climbed up with the aid of their comrades, till they sat tightly squeezed into the tunnel, one behind the other. Uthard's voice was muffled as it floated back to the 3.
It gets better up front.
With that, he started crawling forward on all 4s. At times, the tunnel narrowed even more, till they had to edge forward on their elbows, and they almost felt buried alive. It was completely dark behind the torchbearer. The smell of the clay earth was pungent and stifling. Evrain thought of the far horizons and blue sky of the ocean at keel, and groaned inwardly. It was hard to breathe. After what seemed an eternity, it became a passage proper, in which they were able to manage a crouching walk. Evrain had his teeth clamped together, and tried to think of nothing but putting one foot in front of the other. Behind him, Lur was breathing heavily again, obviously uncomfortable with his surroundings. The floor sloped downwards and to the right. It was also uneven, making it difficult to keep one's footing in the dark. More than once, one of them stumbled and blundered into the person in front. It was a relief when they arrived in a large cavern and could straighten up. Uthard grinned at them.
Catch your breath. We still have some way to go.
He lifted the torch so they could see the walls glistening around them. Columns of polished stone reached from the floor and down from the obscured ceiling, in places touching to form pillars and arches, the architecture of Myril itself.
There are amazing sights under these mounds, even if it's not so easy to find them.
Lur mumbled something under his breath, but Evrain and Gareth stared, the discomfort momentarily forgotten. The boy reached out a hand to touch the smooth surface of a nearby sculpted sweep of rock. He spoke his thoughts aloud.
It is like a temple.
The words were caught in the vault and whispered back to him.
No marble in the Nigerian king's palace can compare with it.
The moundsman moved the torch around proudly.
This is some of the finest in all these hills.
Gareth was reminded of another stone he had touched in his former life. Though there was potency here too, it was of an altogether different kind. This place knew secrets beyond time, for it was older than time. It had witnessed the awakening of Myril, soon after the shaping had ceased, and locked in its silent structures was something of the purpose of that creation. Yet it held no meaning for him, no explanation to offer to this little shadow passing through so fleetingly. He pulled away his hand.
We must hurry.
Uthar pointed to a dark hollow on their left.
There is a good mile or so before we will leave the tunnels.
He marched off with a quickened pace, the others following in silence. Lauren's eyes had dipped into a bank of thin night fog on its way to the western horizon by the time they could finally escape the dark of the caverns. It was amazingly good to inhale the fresh night air after the musty underground, and they sat down for a moment to do just that. Uthard urged them on.
Look at the eyes. The third watch is almost spent. There are only 2 hours before dawn.
He knelt down next to Evrain and opened his back.
I have brought you some supplies, dried meat and flatbread, but you will have little time for eating.
He handed the Aeronite a wineskin.
Drink this now, it will revive you.
What is it?
Evrain removed the stopper and sniffed at the contents of the skin. It was unfamiliar to him.
Mead, a little strong but sweet, made from honey.
He smiled at them.
You have water?
Gareth sounded a little perturbed. Uthard's smile waned.
Yes, of course. Here.
He handed the boy another skin, obviously disappointed. Evrain lifted the mead to his mouth and drank deeply. It was nectar, sweet and potent, leaving a tingling on his tongue as he handed it to Lur.
A fine brew, Master Uthard. If times were different, I would ask you for the recipe. Don't mind the boy. He has no stomach for anything stronger than milk.
Here he smiled at Gareth, who wanted to reply, but was interrupted by the loud sigh of satisfaction coming from Lur.
Ah, that is the first good thing I've seen in this part of the land. Excepting ye, of course.
He nodded at Uthard.
This could put the fire back in your bones.
Uthard looked from one to the other, pleased with himself.
You will need the fire ere this day is out.
He rose to his feet.
Head for the tip of the archer's arrow.
He pointed to a constellation above the southeastern horizon.
And keep to the valleys and gorges. You are sure to strike the main road to Rosfarin after about 5 miles. From there you could make it on the trot before the noon watch.
On the trot.
Lur was incredulous.
You think we can run all the way?
You expect to stroll? They will hunt you with the dogs as soon as they discover your absence, which will be just after dawn. I can assure you that they will make all haste to recapture you. Yennik will not be pleased with this night's work, and someone will be made to pay for it.
Evrain tore himself a strip of the dried goat's meat and looked at it unenthusiastically.
Have these mound dwellers gone insane to declare their hostility so openly? What do they stand to gain from hunting the king's soldiers?
You will have to eat that while you walk.
Uthard indicated the meat, and then motioned to them to get up.
Insane is the correct word, Captain Evrain. For since the arrival of that whoreson from the east, little has been normal about the clan. I doubt very much if Yennik himself still keeps reason.
He stooped to pick up his empty pack.
I will leave you now. May Imran watch over you.
Wait!
Evrain's voice was urgent.
I have 100 questions.
You have no time, though. Not if you wish to survive the night.
Why had they not simply killed us at the crossroads? Why drag us all the way out here?
They have no desire to kill you, yet. It is only your captive that they want, and not them so much as their masters. It appears his death is part of a payment, and only if performed by the appropriate people, and in the correct way.
The men turned to look at the boy. Gareth's mind was ablaze with the scene at the death tree. That would have been his death, his sacrifice. He stared at Uthard. Here were more of those frustrating secrets.
How do you know this?
He had meant to challenge the man, but his words sounded more like a plea. The moundsman made no reply. Evrain was frowning at him.
What is happening here?
There is no time. Besides, it matters little now. They will not let any of you escape.
He turned to go.
Who is your master?
Uthard turned back. He seemed not to have heard the question.
One last thing. We can protect you in Kiel, but keep a lookout till you are south of the rock. They will not give up easily.
He strode off down the hillside. They covered the 23 miles to safety in a haze of fatigue and apprehension. They dared not spare themselves by slackening the pace, for there was no way of knowing when their escape would be discovered and the pursuit would commence. They stopped only once, for a little while, to consume the remainder of their provisions and catch their breath. Lur's face was haggard, and he had something to say about running away from brigands in his own country, and his 40 cycles that had taken their toll. He no longer had the stamina of his youth. Before he saw the first farmsteads of Rusfarin 2 hours later, he had cursed the whole race of mound dwellers roundly. The city was a welcome sight indeed, and they entered it at a slow walk. Gareth had to don the hood of his cloak once more, but he stared out from under it at the unfamiliar sights. The city wall had fallen into disrepair, but would still serve as an obstacle to a marauding enemy. Prosfarin had not seen a battle since the reconquest of Grin's Keep, almost 3 centuries before. It was a prosperous place, surrounded by rich farmland and good grazing, and situated on one of the trade routes to the capital. The main streets were paved and wide, the houses here of strong stone and large. Evrain decided to avoid the crowds of the market squares and alehouses. He led them into narrower, cobbled streets in search of an inn. For a brief while, they stopped in a small, deserted yard, where the cold, fresh water from an ornate stone-cradled fountain proved impossible to resist. It was hard to believe, sitting in the daylight, that they had ever been trapped in the dark underground. Yet their long crawl had left on them an undeniable evidence of filth, not unlike the coverings sported by the barbarians from which they had escaped. Lur could not help pointing it out, to the hilarity of all, and surmised that any respecting innkeeper would show them the door in their present condition. They attempted to remove some of the dirt at the fountain, at least from their faces, where a careless sleeve or glove had left reddish smears. Then they sat for a while, legs outstretched, the cold water dripping from their hair onto besmirched cloaks and shirts. Gareth was unbelievably tired, in body and mind. His legs were quivering with the extraordinary exertion inflicted on them during the last day, and even his shoulders smarted from the 5 miles or so that he had carried Lur's pack. He was sure they were covered in bruises, and so were his feet, unaccustomed to the extra weight put on them. The small of his back ached all the time, whether he moved or not. His thoughts were dull from lack of sleep and the constant strain. He could not imagine anything better than a good bath and a soft bed. He peered through half-closed lids at the others. They seemed a little better shape than he. Lur was no longer young, his soldier's beard flecked with gray, his brow lined. Evrain alone had some fight left in him. Gareth looked at him closely as he sat with his eyes closed. He could not be much older than 35, but there were lines round his mouth, and the region of his eyes was furrowed and dark. The boy had seen the sad expression in those gray-green eyes when Evrain was lost in thought and silent. He realized, too, that he had been the sole reason for the Aaronite's latest scrape with danger. Neither Lur nor Evrain would have been molested by the mound dwellers had he not been with them. They could have left him in Grin's Keep. They could have left him to die in the snow. Kenath had been right in his judgment. These were good men. Lur rose to his feet with a groan.
I can think of a more comfortable place to fall asleep.
Evrain opened his eyes and caught the boy staring at him. The latter, held by his own thoughts, did not look away. The man smiled a little, sadly, and reached for his pack. It was odd, the effect this child had on him. Was he under some spell? Had Lur been right all the time, and this Viron princeling had worked some magic on them to take him into their lands? He laughed inwardly at himself. What a silly notion. On 3 occasions the boy had almost perished. Not even a fool would have concocted a plan like that. No, this boy's life was in his hands, and he liked the thought of it. Imran had willed it, the same as the drowning of his own child. He would accept this, the same as, eventually, he would have to accept the other. It was impossible to stay awake. Gareth tried his utmost, but the warm, soapy water cocooned his entire body up to the chin, and the rounded edge of the tub even allowed his neck to be relieved of the weight of his head. He could relax completely, allowing his thoughts to drift. Back they rolled, past the staring, hook-nosed innkeeper, the smells from the kitchen that had set his stomach cramping with hunger, The odd wooden signboard with merchant's meat painted in bold brown letters above a carcass on a spit, dripping its fatness into the fire, onto the cobbled lanes of the city and the wide fields of the farms, till he could sense again the horrible fate that still pursued him like the hounds of a relentless hunter. He started, splashing the now lukewarm water this way and that. The shadow in his dream dispersed to nothingness. There was no one in the tub room but him. He stood up slowly, back onto his complaining legs. After removing the stopper with his toes, he stepped out onto the stone floor and reached for a towel. He realized at once that he had nothing to wear apart from the shirt Evrain had lent him since their first encounter in the watchman's tent. Their filthy clothes had been taken to be laundered by a disapproving maid from the inn. He remembered how she had held it at arm's length while shaking her head. Now he was in a predicament, unless, yes, on the bench next to Evrain's large shirt was a folded pair of hose, pale blue in color. When he shook out the hose, he realized immediately that it was, like the shirt, impossibly large, yet he had no choice but to pull it on. Tightening the drawstring to keep it from falling down, he stepped into his boots. At least something fitted him properly. He almost laughed at himself as he regarded the loose garment. The shirt would hide most of it, though. Unfortunately, it was green, and did not exactly go with the hose. He tightened this at the waist with his old girdle, and left the tub room feeling that he had to look completely ridiculous. He could not remember what room Evrain had rented for them, and was forced to go and inquire in the common room, where there would undoubtedly be several city folk eating or sipping ale. On the way there he bumped into the same maid of earlier, to his great relief, for he could ask her for directions, and thus avoid going among the people. She stared at him as he approached, and he colored a little, thinking she found his attire ludicrous. In fact, she had not paid attention to him before, supposing him to be a servant of some sort to one of the soldiers with whom he traveled. Now she looked at him properly. She was dismayed to discover that he was a foreigner, and a Viron enemy to boot. She recoiled as if he was some poisonous thing, and stood with her back against the wall to let him pass. When it appeared that he wanted to speak with her, she pointed a nervous finger in the direction of the common room and said,
They are in there, you understand?
Gareth at first thought there had to be something wrong with her mind, but quickly realized that she was terrified of him because of what he was. It was amusing and yet mortifying. He did not know how to react, and merely stood staring, his lips slightly parted in the unspoken request. She glanced behind her, as if looking for some way of escape. Then she nodded at him, as at a very young or mentally deficient child. Again she pointed.
In the common room. Just there. Go. You must go. Understand?
She sounded a little desperate, as if she suspected he might throw himself at her at any moment and snap at her ankles like a rabid dog. Gareth shrugged.
Yes, I understand perfectly. Thank you very much. Good eventide to you.
He left her alone with her expression of surprise. The men were seated in the far corner, away from the windows and noisy crowding round the ale counter. Gareth kept to the wall, avoiding eye contact and the proximity of the inn patrons. Even so, he felt as if all eyes in the place followed his every move. Evrain and Lur looked up as he approached. Both of them wore bemused, albeit tired, expressions. Evrain was the first to speak.
What is your opinion of the Nurian fashion, Lur?
The other smiled broadly as he appraised Gareth's appearance.
Quite fetching, I would venture, though this young fop should speak to his tailor.
Either that, or he should gain a few pounds in weight. In Kiel, the west wind would get a hold of him in no time and blow him out to sea.
They chuckled roundly at their own pleasantries, and even more heartily when the blood rushed to his cheeks. Lur stood up and slapped him on the back.
Don't fear, Master Gareth. In Erin, we do not let our guests starve. You'll soon fill out that shirt.
He motioned to the boy to sit down on the bench where he had been seated. Gareth moved up to give him room, while he noticed a small warm dish with stewed beef and vegetables on their table. There was also fresh bread, and some fruit, raisin cakes, and honeycomb. No, the Aaronites certainly would not let him starve. Neither did they believe in going hungry themselves. His mouth watered. They kept up their banter while he ate, and he found it reassuring rather than annoying, for the spirit was comradely and even friendly, with the result that he could put the odd experience with the maid out of his mind. Somewhere during the past few days he had been promoted from spy to guest, and this was more than he could have hoped for. He did notice, however, that the men both went fully armed, even at table. They were taking Uthar's warning very seriously, and would not relax their vigilance before reaching home. The sun had not properly set before they retired. Evrain had rented a room with 4 beds at the back of the inn. They had no neighbors, and it would hopefully be quieter here, away from the common room and its boisterous occupants. The bedding seemed fresh enough for such a little used room, and Gareth sighed contentedly at the warm embrace of bed linen and woolen blankets. Almost 10 days had passed since he had left his room in Belruth on his way to see Riad. He had slept in many a strange and uncomfortable bed from that nightmare day till now. Mostly he had woken to fear and despair, but now it seemed quite different. These 2 men did not owe him anything, not kindness or friendship, or some feeble loyalty because of ties of kinship or race. He had been betrayed by all these. The ones who should have been his enemies had proven most true. How strange it was. If he could be spent like coins for benefit, if any man were just goods and chattels for the king's design, where did one live in this world beyond the reach of fear? Who could one trust? He remembered the face of his father in Kenneth's window. Had there been some sadness, at least, at his death? Could it be that he had been so offensive that his passing should be cause for rejoicing? Had it even been true, what he had seen there, or had it merely been what the odd mountain man had wanted him to see? He had to laugh at the nonsense in his mind, the slow mixture of memories now swirling into fathomless fog. Gareth was awake and alert in an instant. Something had drawn him from the world of dreams, something urgent that rescued him from the nightly struggle. He lifted his head to listen, and probed the dark with his eyes. A pale pattern of starlight fell through the trellised windows onto the door. It played on the folded bedclothes of the spare bed they had moved in front of it as a precaution. It deepened the shadows in the far corners of the room. The door. A minuscule movement had caught his eye. The metal round of the knob had slipped silently back into its original place. Someone had tried the door handle to see whether it was locked. Someone who did not want to alert them. He reached across the gap between Evrain's bed and his, and dug his fingers into the man's arm. There was a sharp intake of breath, then Evrain lifted his head.
The door!
His whisper was urgent but low. The man's entire body tensed. Then he reached for the sleeping Lur and his sword at the same time. He motioned the boy to the corner behind the door with his eyes. He and Lur stationed themselves on either side. Gareth had secured Lur's long dagger for himself, more for reassurance than any heroic notions. If there would be fighting, he would probably just get in their way. It was completely silent. The faint light slid down the metal blades of the men's swords. The dagger was heavy in his hand. Had he imagined the movement? A thundering crash made them jump almost out of their skins. There was evidently no more attempt at stealth. The door seemed to bulge inwards, but the heavy bed held it. There were sounds of bewilderment in the passage outside, then a shouted command, and a renewed assault on the door. This brought a splintering of wood as the door almost disintegrated before their eyes. Evrain and Lur lifted their weapons. 2 figures flung themselves into the room, half stumbling over the bed. The men struck. Sharp cries of pain filled the place, but there were more shadows, several more, forcing their way in. Some grappled with the Aaronites. They were shouting now, in a foreign tongue, angry, afraid. Gareth lifted the blade, his breath caught in his throat. A cry of anguish, a death rattle. Was it Lur? He could not make out his companions in the struggle. Another shadow had entered the room. It was not interested in the fighting, but searched through the darkness instead, its gaze fastened on him. Instantly, he was on the hillside in Uria, the sickly fear washing over him, the shadow of a dead tree robbing him of thought and motion. A bark of command was issued. At least 2 of the attackers detached themselves from the struggle and turned towards him. They had trouble making out his form in the corner. Their eyes were not made for the dark. They came on nonetheless, reaching for him. He had to force the death tree from his thoughts. A measure of control returned to his mind. His hand steadied somewhat. They were from the mounds. He could almost smell the earth upon them. How strange that these creatures had lived underground, could see so little in the night. He jumped to the side and swung the dagger with all his strength. There was a brief moment of horrid satisfaction as he felt it go home and heard a gasp of pain and surprise. Then the leather and cloth wrenched the weapon from his hand. Fingers fastened on his loose shirt. He twisted free, stumbling. A hideous moaning filled the room, but he hardly noticed it. His nightmares had come to life, and there was no escape. The bald man filled the doorway. His touch was horror and death. Gareth blundered into the knot of bodies. His senses were reeling. He wanted to scream for the moaning to stop, and then the grip tightened on him. One of the moundsmen had him by the arm and behind his neck like a pup picked up by its mother. He was stunned by the strength in the fingers, the brutal force that held him, and he knew he could not shake it off. A figure in a white shirt loomed in front of him. There was a flash of steel, and he was released at once. Evrain. The Aeronite turned back to aid Lur, still embroiled with 3 other men. The back of his shirt was stained darkly. The moundsman's leader, seeing his plans go awry, drew a curved blade and launched himself into the fight. Gareth saw his intention and shouted a warning to Evrain, who turned in time to avoid the blow aimed at his back. The bald man moved in a peculiar way, with short, jerking motions, and wielded his weapon in a similarly unfamiliar pattern. Evrain found it difficult to parry the attacks, and backed away gradually till he had his back against the far wall. The boy searched frantically for some weapon with which to come to his aid, even if it would only distract the fiend for a moment and allow the Aeronite to counterattack. He saw the hilt of his dagger still protruding from the direly wounded man he had struck earlier. The fellow was crawling towards the door, though his breath was gurgling in his throat. Gareth found it suddenly and impossibly repulsive to retrieve the weapon from this body. He hesitated, looking for an alternative. The doorway gaped emptily. He could run for it. There was a gasp from Lur as one of his assailants found a mark for his blade. Gareth's indecision vanished. He had the dagger in his hand and was rushing forward. Before he realized what he was doing, he was angry. Angry that he had to struggle for his life. Angry that these men could hurt Lur and Evrain. Perhaps he shouted, for they turned away from the crumpling form of their victim and came at him instead. He could not care for the sharp points and keen edges of their weapons, not for their huge advantage in strength and size, nor even for the fact that there were 3 of them. He went at them like a wildcat, and they did marvel at his ferocity as they missed their aim and cleaved the air with their axes. The dark proved to serve him better than any skill or armor. He had stabbed at them several times, sending one down on his knees before another got hold of him and wiped out what advantage he had. Fingers fastened on his throat, and a fist crashed into the side of his head. There was an explosion of blinding pain. Another blow followed, not as severe. He tasted the blood in his mouth. He reeled under this assault, stumbled over a body, and fell backward. The crushing weight of the man came down on top of him. Through the blur of pain, he realized that he had lost the dagger. His hands were empty. His attacker, who had dropped his axe to grab him, drew a knife from his belt. At the same time, there was a commotion outside the room. Many voices clamored. Torchlight flooded through the door. A moundsman appeared at the man's shoulder, his eyes wide with fear. He was shouting. The bald man leaped past him, over the bed in the doorway. The man on top of him was big. He twisted frantically under the heavy hand that was slowly choking him. The knife thudded into the floorboard next to his face. There was a sharp pain as the blade grazed his cheek. His arms were free, but he did not possess the strength to break the man's grip. He felt for the face above him, but could only reach a stubbly chin. Absurdly, he wondered what had happened to the correct way in which he was supposed to die. He struck the leather-clad chest ineffectually with his fist. He gripped the goatskin between his fingers and waited for the unavoidable blow. All the noise seemed to fade. Even the rushing of blood in his head slowed. If only he could have some air. What was taking the man so long? The hand rose up, fingers large and rough, dirty. For a moment he saw another hand, fair and thin, clutched round the gold of a goblet, crimson liquid, the blood of grapes, with dark fatal sting beneath.
Mother.
He had no breath to say it. It was a dream, another dream in which he was sinking, and somewhere there was light, if the knife would only fall. Between his fingers, curiously, the leather bulged. A spike of metal appeared, warm with blood. Then just as abruptly it vanished, as the blade that had skewered his assailant was retracted. Down clattered the death knife. Down slumped the body, bathing him in scarlet hemlock wine. The throttling hold relaxed.
Get it off him!
Avery.
There were many voices now, and there was the light, but the pain of his dream would not go away. He lay gasping like a fish on dry land, his hands too heavy to explore his bruised throat and discover the reason why he still could get no breath. Strong hands lifted him and placed him on a bed. He was safe, but the darkness crawled in, obscuring his vision. Now he was floating away, with half a thought that somewhere in the blackness he could find his way back to that room and tell her that he knew about the goblet.